Okay, all right. So welcome on Tuesday, the 1st of July. I think a date would be nice, 2025. Here we are for another Minima dev chat. I think I've come to the conclusion that we're trying to make it devy, talk tech, but I'm not gonna do as much showing smart contracts and stuff because, I mean, that is nice, but I think that gets a little bit too low level. So I'm sorry that I wasn't here last week to do one of these. I am actually really enjoying these little conversations that we have, but I was up in London doing a podcast, and actually it was a funny one really because the interview was fantastic. The setup was a proper setup with like 3 cameras in some studio in Soho. Blah blah blah. I was wearing like a jacket and I've realised that wasn't my seat of power. This room, this little box that I live in. This is my seat of power, and I felt that I did quite badly actually. I didn't get into the flow. It wasn't my best, and I'm sorry about that. I know when they release it, they'll chop it and they'll make it do stuff, whatever. But I didn't feel that I was very illuminating, and I don't feel that But I'm sorry about that. But one thing that it did make me think was AI. And they kept asking me about AI. And those of you that know me and have, like, Will's not here, but those of you that know me know that I'm quite disparaging about, AI. And especially the mixture of AI and blockchain. Like, blockchain is cool. AI, clearly pretty cool. There's some amazing stuff happening there. But blockchain and AI somehow, either it makes me think it's some sort of, it's a narrative twist. It's, they're trying to merge these two big industries together to come up with an even bigger story. And and at the end of it, I sort of said this to him, and I said, I'm sorry, I didn't say very much, but I don't feel that that, blah blah blah. And he was cool about it actually, and he said, well, you sure there's nothing, is there nothing that you can do? There's a lot going on here. There must be some synergy. There's always synergies between different industries. And I did have a think about it, and I think I've come up with something that might work with AI and blockchain. And that's because, so I'm working on this, Omnia stuff at the moment, which is going well. I'm in the complicated bit at the moment, sending messages backwards and forwards over Maxima, blah, blah, blah. And with the eventual goal, hopefully, of being able to knock up some sort of poker application. Yeah, that's what I'd like to do. Some sort of game. I'd like to do some games. Yeah, poker's one of them, but there could be other games. I mean, you can't see, the camera doesn't point, but I've got a lot of board games over there. I like playing games. And if you're and so the way it could work is that some people are going to run trustless poker servers, and you're going to log into those servers for multiplayer game. For 2-player games, you can play over Maxima, that's fine. But if you've got 5 people sitting around a table, Maxima, I'm not sure whether Maxima's quite, the app. I mean, you could do Maxima, that's fine, but it would be much more efficient and much faster if you could just log into a, broadcast tool chat server, where encrypted messages were just sent from one person to all the people that were connected. And you could use that for lots of different games. You could use it for poker, you could use it for board games, you could use it for chess, whatever you want to do. That sort of, that's what you could use. And the reason you would run those servers is because you would get paid, yeah, like you get a small amount, a small rake of every pot. Obviously trustless, that's the whole point. All of the computation is done in smart contracts and off-chain and Omnia, but the message delivery, if you provide liquidity, if you provide a service, if you're saying, look, you can use me as your server, then I think you should be paid for that. It won't be a lot, but the more people you provide this service to, then the more money you make. And then I was thinking, well, I'm trying to do this for poker. And so what I thought was, does that make, running a little poker chat server sort of like an AI? Because actually what you're trying to do is you're trying to write an application that incentivizes you to run it by paying you. Yeah. And this sounds familiar because actually that's what miner-centric chains do. Yeah, there's a piece of software out there, and that software says, look, if you run me, I'll pay you. You don't actually have to do anything. You don't have to do any money, but if you run me, I'll pay you. That's how Lightning works. When you add liquidity, it's like, look, if you run this piece of software and you set me up correctly, then I'll pay you for running me. That's a very interesting, it's a very interesting concept that we've now got, how these sort of inanimate things can now pay you because they somehow generate more revenue, and, so you can get paid for doing it and they spread. And so when I was trying to think about this with regards to AI, what if you had a system where I mean, at its simplest, what you could do is you could say, look, I'll run an LLM on my computer and I'll let you access it for Minima. Yeah, so you pay me a Minima and I'll let you do I'll let you do a call on my LLM and I'll give you the answer. A thousandth of a minute, a millionth of a Minima. Some small amount per request that you're asking the LLM. And I think that would work. I think actually you could do that. And the tricky part with all of these paying for computation, the thing that always bungs up the works is, how do you know he's actually done the work? How do you know? So with my little poker server, it's fine because it's like we're all talking to each other and I can objectively tell whether the server is doing what it says it should be doing, which is that it's transmitting the messages to all the other users. If it doesn't work, I'll just disconnect from you and connect to a server that does do it and I'll pay them. But with an LLM, if I was talking to an AI, how do I know you're not just putting it into a random chatbot that just, that doesn't use a lot of processing, that isn't costing you as much as running an LLM to run, and you're just giving me spurious results? And actually, there is a solution to that, and they're called recursive zero-knowledge proofs. And so what you would do is that you would be able to prove with a proof that you had done a sequence of functions, because the actual clever bit of an LLM is only about 28 lines of code, and then it's got access to this big database. And I'm sure with all the tech that's out there now, you would be able to prove each step as a zero-knowledge proof. And then a recursive zero-knowledge proof is interesting because it basically says, look, I'm true, and the previous one, I link to the previous proof, a little bit like a blockchain. And you say, look, I'm true, and in my proof, I can prove that the previous one is true. And then what's nice is if you have the first one and you have the last one, and you know that the last one links to the previous one, and you prove that and the previous one can't be true unless its previous one is true, and that one can't be true, you come up with a single proof which proves all of the steps in the chain. So, proving zero-knowledge proofs is fast, creating them is slow, so that's another issue. But it is possible. There is tech out there that sort of lets you do this. And so you could come up with a sort of AI that you run, and then people send messages to your AI, you pay it, and it returns you the proof and the answer, and you can say, yeah, he did the work, and here's the answer that the LLM gave you. And that's quite, that could work. That's pretty basic, though. I mean, pretty basic in terms of what I'm offering. You can just run my LLM, pretty complicated in actually getting it to work. And then I was thinking, and I've looked into this sort of, can you get sharded AIs? Can you break these AIs into these LLMs into smaller ones? And there does seem to be a lot of work going on in that. I found somewhere called Horde or something, which was a sort of sharded network of lots of different LLMs. And what I mean by that is that if you could somehow make it that the more of you that are running it, and you would obviously have to have communications with each other, maybe over Maxima, maybe over some other system, the bigger the LLM got, the more tokens you could process. And so it wasn't just one LLM for one user, it was the whole thing combined became one large LLM. And then it sort of gets a bit, you start to think, well, what would happen then? And then it's like, well, what if you had this AI that runs on multiple computers and it pays you for running it because you earn Minima for running this piece of software, and this piece of software can communicate with all the other AI LLMs that are out there? Does that mean you'd have a sort of unstoppable AI as long as what it was doing was useful enough for enough people to run it? And then you sort of get into the question, and so I was thinking, I mean, that's pretty hardcore, really. I don't know if you can shard up LLMs in this way, but if you could do that, and you could run it on 1,000 people running it, it's you'd probably get I wonder if it'd be a logarithmic progression of power rather than a linear. So 1,000 of people running it, would that be 1,000 times more powerful, or would that be like the square root of the number of users more powerful than one user running it? You may not get a linear progression. You might get something that just sort of teeters off. But anyway, if it was more powerful, the more people that you ran it, then you sort of start to get into, and I'm going to talk about this, a little bit later. What if it starts doing things that you don't like, and yet it still pays you? Yeah. What does that put a price on something? So, let's, for instance, it could start running a trading bot, and it starts making money. And it's like, yeah, I'll pay you a percentage of how much I'm making. So the more computers I have running me, then the smarter I get, then the more money I make trading, and the more money I pay you to run me. That's kind of a no-brainer. It's like, okay, I'll do that. That's no problem. But what if it started running what if it started running a marketplace? What if it started running the Silk Road? Some people have various opinions about this. Some people go one way, some people go the other. Some believe that you are allowed to buy these things if you want to, it's your life, it's your body, you can do what you want. And some people don't. But then it starts paying you quite a lot, because it starts making quite a lot of money. And then it starts paying you to run it so that it can run this marketplace. And it's sort of and remember, we've created this thing, so now as long as somebody's running it, it won't stop. And as long as enough of you run it for it to be smart enough to continue making enough money to pay you, then you can't turn it off. And then it's like, you start sort of going down this rabbit hole of, is that, are we already on that path? What happens when they start doing, other things that we don't, it starts doing something you don't agree with, but it pays you loads of money. It says, like, I'll give you 10 grand a month. And you're like, I don't agree with what you're doing. And it's like, well, fine, just turn it off. And you're like, wow, it sort of monetizes the desires of people, because it's like, look, I'll pay for that service. There's enough people on the planet that will pay for that service. And if the AI is prepared to do it and it's prepared to pay you to run it, we see this. This is how Bitcoin works. This is how Ethereum works. Ethereum pays you to run it. The software pays you, not the people. The Bitcoin software pays you to run it if you're a miner, and it's clearly paying them a lot of money because they're all doing it. And they're agnostic. They don't care if people say, I don't like it, I don't like this. It's like, well, I don't care what you think. Bitcoin pays me, and so I run it. So that I think that's a road that we're going to go down. I think this technology is going to lead down that path. If you can think of something, we can do it, and we'll do it. Basically, I don't know who proved that mathematically, but if you can't think of something, then we obviously can't do it. And there are things that we can't think of, but once we think of something, it's almost like, right, we'll have that in 10 years. We'll have an AI that runs itself and pays you to run it, and it will do stuff that we either find useful or we don't. So I didn't say any of this in the podcast. I wish I had, but I didn't. So yeah, afterwards, only in retrospect did I think, what could we have, what we could talk about. But it did let me think about all this stuff about software that pays you, and how it does that, and what the usefulness of it. And also, some of you might be sitting there going, oh, but power mining, we don't like miner-centric chains. Minima doesn't like it because it centralizes. And actually, what I liked about this is that you can build centralized systems on top of a decentralized chain. So even if this AI starts to because what would happen is, would there be more than one, or would one of them be the one that pays the most? Is this a winner-take-all game, or is this a game where lots of them are going to be competing against each other? In general, winner seems to take all in most of these scenarios. And it's okay to have, and even if we go to the Lightning and you're running a Lightning node, and people get upset about the fact that it becomes hub and spoke, which basically means that there's going to be some big players who have thousands of channels and lots of little players, and they think of that as centralization, and centralization bad. And it's like, not all centralization is bad. You can build centralized systems on top of decentralized tech. You just can't build decentralized tech on top of centralized systems. So as long as your base layer remains decentralized, it doesn't matter if these things come along, because eventually they'll either be good enough, they'll either be worth, what they're offering, or they won't, and some other system will turn up and overtake it. So, you can build centralized systems on top of Minima because it's continually decentralized. But if you ask me, you can't build decentralized tech on top of Ethereum or any of these other chains because they're totally centralized. And so, the chain is only as decentralized as its most centralized component, and everything above it inherits the qualities of the row below. So anyway, this all came out of the conversations that I was having, after I'd done this podcast. So that's coming out in the next couple of weeks, and I hope you enjoy it. Before I move on to my next thing, does anybody? It's a pity Will's not here. He's our sort of AI guy. Does anybody want to have a little chat about how they think AI and blockchain and might synergize in some way in the future? You don't have to.
Feel free to put your hands up.
He has re-enabled
this is a
that
safe
feature.
space.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Okay. So that was something, and you never know how these things are going to turn out. And when I was in the conversation, I wish this had come up, but it didn't. But there we go. The next thing I want to talk about is, has any of you seen that Twitter video that I shared? I think Neo, hopefully, I don't know if you shared it on Twitter or if Luke did or something,
Yeah.
whatever, where it was the Tether CEO talking about Lightning and basically saying exactly what we've been saying, all of us, for the last 5 years, which is that, and I really liked it because he used a term that I have not used yet, nor had I heard it, but when he said it, it was like, that's the way to explain it. And he was saying that none of the L2s, none of the blockchains, none of them scale because they use SSS. They use a single shared state, which means that everybody has to access this one thing, which is why he's correct. That doesn't scale because you can't have millions of people accessing this one bit of state. You can't have everybody accessing that. That's the bottleneck. Whereas Lightning and Omnia, and L2 and all of these things, they work, they scale because you don't have single shared state. You have multiple states. Every single channel has its own state, and it is independent of all the other states. And he was saying, and that's exactly what he said. And that he was saying, how are we going to scale USDT to become this global cash system that everybody's going to use? And I'll chip in here and say that USDT is a temporary solution to our current problem. So currently everybody expects a stable coin. We all use US dollar, but 20 years from now, no one is going to be using US dollar. We're all going to be using either, Minima or Bitcoin or whoever wins this battle between us, because the price will have become, far more stable. It'll go up by 5% a year, whatever it is. And so you'll actually be able to price things in it without these massive fluctuations. So this is a temporary solution. We need some way of letting the world access the cash. And he was going, hey, you've got to use Lightning. And actually what's interesting about that is that the way they're doing it on Bitcoin is that they're using something called taproot assets. And the way that works is, so it has the Lightning Network currently exists and it works and it has liquidity and there's lots of nodes out there sending each other Bitcoins. And they're saying, well, look, how can we use that? Because we don't have tokens on the Lightning Network. We just have Bitcoin channels sending Bitcoin. And so the way that taproot assets work is that you have an entry node and an exit node, and they basically buy the dollars, sell the dollar at either end, and send using Bitcoin, the rails, across the Lightning Network. What's nice about that is that you can still use the Lightning Network, that all the liquidity in the Lightning Network works, but you do need to have these two people at the front and the end of the transaction so that you can send this token. You basically sell it for Bitcoin over here, and then you sell the Bitcoin and buy the token back here, and you give it back. And the way that the token is recorded for you is called a taproot asset, which is just the way that Bitcoin does it. Taproot assets themselves, I don't really like. It's a lot less, it seems pretty centralized. You have to have a central database basically of the data, which is, there's really no provision for doing tokens on Bitcoin, but it's a solution and it's semi-decentralized, but it sort of works. But anyway, that's how they're doing it. And he was very cool. He's like, this is the way, this is the only way that it's going to scale. There are issues with that, he said. And if anybody saw that video, I think the issues that he is referring to is the onboarding issue. This is always the problem with Lightning. It's like, how are you going to get 1 billion people on the network? Because you need to have one transaction per user. This is the thing about going onto layer 2 on Lightning. You need a transaction to get onto layer 2, and you need a transaction to get off layer 2. But once you're on there, you can muck about, you can do stuff on layer 2, but it takes a transaction, which kind of makes sense. You're kind of like, I can see why that would be the case. But clearly, if you want to get 7 billion people with a Lightning channel, that's like more transactions than 3 years worth of Bitcoin blocks. It's like, that's not going to happen. I mean, it's like, how are you going to possibly do this? And there are, as always, people coming up with solutions for this. And one of those solutions is state chains, which basically means that you have two people and one of them keeps the key and you give your key to somebody else, which means that even though both of you have a key, you need the second entity to steal the coins, and the second entity could be a federation of people, so you need this federation of users, etc., to steal the coins. But in that way, you can give UTXOs to people, you can give whole coins to people off-chain. And so if you had 10,000 coins off chain, they could service millions of users because users would use them and then they'd run out and then they'd go and some other user would come in and he would be given it and blah, 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 blah. So it's a really nice solution. But, and this is what I liked about it, there are issues in this system that Minima fixes. And so having the Lightning Network, the Bitcoin-backed Lightning Network with the input and the output node works. It has, issues with who is the beginning node and who is the end node and blah blah blah. But it would be better, if you wanted to come up with the perfect system. If you were like, look, now that we know that Lightning works, Lightning's a protocol. It's not chain dependent. You need a UTXO system, and you can use Lightning. If you wanted to come up with a perfect system, what would that be? Well, you'd want a native USDT token network, wouldn't you? What you'd want, and this is what Minima gives you. Minima gives you that token ID, and you can create channels not in Minima. You can create them in Minima, obviously, but you can also create them in USDT. And if you had a USDT native Lightning network, you wouldn't need the guy at the front and the end. You wouldn't need the person to buy in, transmit, and buy out. You could just be sending USDT, and that would create less friction. That would create the reason, mathematically, I think the reason that would be cool is because you'd eventually pay less fees for that system. The less friction there is in the system, the smoother it is, then the cheaper it can be, the more liquidity can be added, the more users can join in, et cetera, et cetera. These things are all good for the simple reason that eventually it'll be cheaper to use that system than the other system. So in the battle of the marketplaces, it's like I'm going to use the native USDT Lightning Network rather than this, selling Bitcoin outing. So that's nice. And one of the other things that's nice is that these state chain systems work really well on Minima. Because as we've had our discussions, we're sort of wondering whether or not Bitcoin is going to be able to add any functionality, at all. Will it ever get L2? I hope it does. I want L2. But we do that, and that's a really big advantage. That really helps in the friction. That really helps in the liquidity. So if I was playing devil's advocate and I was like, look, I want the perfect system that can scale for billions of users as a USDT payment network, Minima ticks all those boxes. I couldn't come up with a better system than the one I could build on Minima. I could come up with a better system than the one they're building on Bitcoin. Can't really do it on Ethereum because it's not UTXO backed. The nonce, you need to have pre-signed transactions, and if the nonce is the same and you can't, broadcast it, I have tried. So it's like, if I had to come up with a perfect system, Minima provides all the tech that we currently can think of that would give us a really good system. And I thought that was, and I thought that was cool. That doesn't mean USDT are going to say, let's stop using Bitcoin. We're going to start using Minima. As much as I'd like them to do that, I don't think they are going to do that. But we are going to, see if we can get a little chat in. See if we can get hold of him. I'm sure he's a pretty busy chap, frankly. And see if we can mention that, look, if you were going to start this from fresh and you wanted to have a pop at it, you're worth billions. Why not chuck 5 million or whatever the hell it is at trying to come up with the perfect network for doing it? Because this does the tech you need. This ticks all the boxes. Simple. It's the most decentralized, the most scalable. This is what you could do. So I found that to be really, really interesting and a real vote of of validation and of confidence in what we have been saying, because that's what we say, all the layer twos, all the side chains, all of that stuff, they're interesting and they have their use cases, but scalable, to the max so that the whole world can use them isn't one of them, and so I think that's nice. I think that showed us that we're going down the right path on a technical level. And that all this Omnia stuff that I'm working on from a technical point of view isn't just a total waste of time, which would be slightly upsetting. So that was the second thing that I thought was quite interesting. Just to say that I did meet him at some party that we were at, and he sat next to me, and I did have this chat with him, and I was ranting at him about this. But this is about 2 years ago. I'm not saying that that's why. This is what I said to him. I was like. This is what you want. You want Lightning. You want Omnia. That's the only tech that scales. Blah blah blah. I'm sure, he probably may have thought of that before I ranted to him incessantly for the whole of the lunch. But anyway, I do remember having a chat with him at some point, and he's techie. He was the CTO. Now he's the CEO. So, Lightning, Omnia, good tech, scalable tech. People are starting to realize this is the only way that this is going to work, and that all the other things are, in fact, I was just continuing on that point about other chains and whatever. I know today is quite an important day because they're just releasing the stocks. Yeah, there's lots of companies out there like Robinhood and Circle and Coinbase that are releasing stocks as tokens. And I asked Neo earlier whether he thought that was bullish, whether that's bullish for Ethereum and Solana and the chains that run this. And my take on this is that it's not bullish. I'm sorry. I know people I see on Twitter, they're all going, yes, this is it. This is the moment. This is ETH to 10,000. Yeah. And it's like, don't you understand that if ETH went to 10,000, it totally breaks again? The only reason anybody's using ETH at the moment is because, gas is low. And so we can actually do stuff on it. But as soon as you become valuable again, I can't use it. And so then I have to go off. And it's a really tricky, it's a really fun, sort of issue this, which with no real solution. When you're sort of an app chain, when you're sort of a chain that provides that sort of service, you really want to be as cheap as possible. That's why Solana is eating ETH's lunch at the moment. And as soon as you start becoming valuable so that it starts becoming expensive, which means you have to either completely give up on your decentralization and only have 3 people running it, which means you're totally broken anyway. It doesn't seem to have the solution that people would want it to have. It doesn't have a solution where we're going to be worth loads and loads of money, and still we're going to be having really cheap transactions, because the only way you're going to do that is by having a really centralized system, which means that there's no point using it in the first place, because if you're not decentralized, there's no point using a blockchain. So I'm sorry to all the ETH bag holders and the Solana boys and anybody who thinks that this is actually going to be a plus. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who don't understand any of this, and they might think, I saw somebody on Bloomberg saying that they were going to start up an ETH treasury company now. They're going to be the first one to do that. And I was like, what? Why would you buy the second best asset when you could buy the first asset? That doesn't make any sense. It's like, why would I, you can gamble. Yeah, you can do it as a sort of pop and maybe get in and out, whilst there's still ignorance in the market about what the winning asset is. But in the long run, why would you put your money in the one that goes up slower? Why would you put your money in the one that goes up less? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. So clearly this is still a misunderstood topic. This is, as I've said many, many times, this is a winner-take-all game. And only the winner will be the one that stores all your value. You can't have 2 stores of value. It just doesn't work. You can have app chains that you can jump onto and you can do nice stuff on, and you can do your NFTs over here, and you can, maybe do a few dexes over here. But that has to be quick. It has to be cheap. It has to be fast. And that isn't really what a store of value has to be. That's not what the store of value is trying to do. They're both trying to target a different market with a different, then I'm prepared to accept trust assumptions. I'm prepared to think, well, maybe it's not as decentralized as this, but I don't need it to be decentralized because all I'm doing is trading Apple stock, or blah, 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 but it always sort of boils down to this thing about why bother using a blockchain if what you're doing is legal. No offense, why do anything on a blockchain that is legal? That's the whole point. You need something that is censored, and then you're using censorship resistant tech. And if you're not going to be censored, then you don't need to use it, So that's where we are in the sort of scalability space, and I think that's starting to flood through, and people are starting to understand that's how it should be. And the third thing, which actually sort of applies to both of these things that I've been talking about, that I was thinking about, is that we just had Glastonbury. So I'm in Somerset here. Yeah, that's this is where I'm looking over a field, there's sheep over there, and we've just had Glasto. I didn't go. I'm too old. I went, before, but I don't go anymore. And there's been quite a lot of furore about it. Yeah, there's been quite a lot of sort of, there's been a lot of news and stuff about what people have said and what some of the artists have screamed on stage about this and that, and, we don't like them, and, up with these people and down with those people and blah, blah, blah. And I'm an advocate of free speech. Yeah, I believe you're allowed to say anything. And I mean that truly, as in, if I say to someone, I want you to take that baseball bat and hit him over the head, and he does that, that's his fault, not mine. Yeah, you can't blame the person who told you to do it. If you did it, then that's on you. And also the main reason I like it is because it's a very simple rule. Yeah, what I see out there is very complicated rules where it's like, well, you can sort of say this, but you can't say that. And then if you're in the gray area, then we have to rely on him, the judge, the police, or whatever, and they're the ones that decide whether you overstep the mark, because that is fraught with danger. And we see two-tier systems throughout. We see people. We don't see fairness in the justice. We don't see equality in the way people are treated. That's why simplicity is key. That's why simple rules are key. Not because, but there's gray areas and black and white, and it's like, yeah, but you want a rule which is as simple as possible. And this applies to blockchains and everything. And the reason that this specifically applies to blockchains is because that's exactly what we work on. Yeah, that's what blockchain is. That's what Minima does. That's what we're trying to say is that no one should be able to stop you from sending money or information. I've got chainmail so you can send messages to anyone you want, and I've got Minima so you can send money to anyone you want. The definition of free speech. Money is a form of information. It's basically it's free speech. And the truth is that all of our freedoms are built on free speech. And if you don't have free speech, you don't have the other freedoms. You just can't have them. If I can't talk about stuff, then I can't. If I can't, does freedom of assembly almost requires freedom of speech, because I need to be able to speak to people, to organize that I meet them, and everything is dependent on this basic tenet that I can say stuff without getting into trouble. And I just feel that we've totally blurred the lines. We've lost, where what we're looking at, and am I allowed to send money to anyone I want? I believe that you are, but are they going to start coming for that again? They say, no, you're not allowed to send money to, there's clearly different organizations out there, and clearly different people have different ideas about what those organizations are. Some think some of them are terrorists, some think the other guys are the bad guys, some think these guys are the goodies, and these guys are terrible. And it's like, so who's, now we get into this weird thing where who's going to get to decide whether or not they're the goodies or the baddies? Yeah, because the only arbiter for that is you. Yeah, you're the only one that can determine whether or not you think somebody's a goodie or a baddie, and you're the only one that can determine whether you want to send them some of your value, some of your money, or not. And all of this is, this is what they've been sort of discussing in a very sort of base, lowest common denominator way. That they're sort of saying, there's there's a lady here in England who's in jail because of a tweet that she made where she said some hurty words that somebody didn't like. Okay. And now they're saying that the guy who said the hurty words on stage, he should be going to jail too. And it's like, no, he shouldn't be going to jail. She should be released from jail. Yeah, it's not like we need to punish him as well. She was wrong to be punished, and she should be released. And if I'm completely honest, I think that the level of debate has been pretty base. And we haven't really, really had this discussion about what freedom means. And this is so pertinent to what we do, to the technology that we all love, to the crypto industry, to blockchain, to censorship resistance. This is why we're here. This is exactly this is exactly the problem that we face, that we're trying to fix, because we believe it is right. Not because we're trying to do something shifty. It's like, well, this is your right. You have to have this. This is something important if we want, humans to be a successful species in the galaxy. And if we want to be able to do, the things that we know we're capable of doing, you must have freedom of speech, and you must have freedom of money, value, so that I can give my value to that which I think is valuable. Yeah. If I can't do that, then how is value going to accrue in the things that we as a people think is valuable? How are we going to, this is the absolute fundamental heart of what we're doing here. And I really feel that the discussions that have been had since Glastonbury about what's been going on are interesting, because they've made, hopefully people are having to think about the moral dimension to this and the consequences of it, of this, of this technology. For me, I think about it in terms of blockchain and Bitcoin and money, and what's the moral implications of what we're doing. What does it mean when we live in a world where anybody can send money to anybody? Does that mean that bad things are going to stop happening, or does it mean that more bad things are going to happen? How can I square that with myself as I write this technology? Can people use chain mail to talk about stuff that I really don't think they should be talking about? And I'll refer back to the beginning and I'll say, no, that's, I believe that freedom is a requirement for the greatness of humanity. And I believe that freedom of speech is the bedrock upon which all other freedoms are built. And If there are issues above that tech stack, then we need to fix them. But you don't fix them by attacking freedom of speech. You don't fix them by saying you're not allowed to send value to these people. You fix them with education. You fix them by speaking to people and saying, look, this is what I think because of this, and this is what you're saying because of that, and let's have a discussion about it and see if we can come to, we may not be able to come to some agreement, but that is the way to fix it, not by attacking the tech stack that allows you to have that. Those things are a requirement. And in fact, 99% of people, 99.9% of people probably use that technology, freedom of speech and freedom of money, in a way that is inoffensive to everybody. They're paying for pasta, they're doing this, they're not doing anything that would even ruffle the feathers of anybody. And there is that little element which does. And the idea that you need to penalize the 99.9% just to somehow squash that 0.1%, in the outlier is wrong. And the way to fix them is, this is the question. This is the quest that we're on. How do you fix that? Well, it's not by attacking freedom of speech. It's by, talking to these people, helping these people, trying to educate these people, maybe raising them out of poverty. Maybe the simple answer is you need to make them better economically. This always seems to be a factor. How much money they have. Money underpins everything, and maybe they just need more money. Maybe if we really cared about this issue and they said, look, we can fix it if everybody on the planet gave £100. It's like, well, I don't have £100. It's like, all right, somebody might have to give more than you. But is that? I'm not saying that is a solution, but I'm saying, can we elevate these people out of poverty, out of ignorance, out of all of these things? That's the way to try and sort these problems out. It's funny because 20 years ago we sort of, I don't want to get political about this, but we did have sort of IRA issues in England, and there was all of that. And I saw a very interesting sort of documentary about it. And basically the reason it stopped isn't because the ideology changed and they didn't hate us anymore. It's just because the younger generation weren't poor anymore, and they suddenly started having money and jobs, and the economy boomed, and they were suddenly doing really well. And they were like, well, I don't really want to be doing all of this stuff. I just want to go out and I want to have a party and I want to go to the pub and whatever. And by bringing them out of economic poverty, that fixed it. So it didn't address the issues of the horrificness of some of the things that the English have done to the Irish, or blah blah blah. There's baddies on every side in every argument and every conflict. And the thing that actually fixed it was just make them richer, just make them happier. Just elevate them out of the poorness that they are. And that's what fixed that situation. And I sort of feel that's a classic example of a very objective base way of fixing these problems. Yeah. And if you could just elevate people out of that, you'd have a solution. So yeah, it's made me, think about the morals of what I do and whether it's allowed. And, so if anybody wants to put their hand up, they're more than welcome to. If you want to come up on stage and have a chat about this, it is technical, but it's also sort of moral and ethical. And if you have anything to say, I'd love to hear it. But basically, I'm sort of like, I'm here and I've got a neighbor, and I believe in free speech. And they look over the fence and they're building a weapon. They're building a weapon in their shed. And they tell me that when the weapon's finished, they're going to kill me and my family. All right. And they're not doing that. But I'm just saying, if that were the case, do I have any justification for going around there, and doing something, physically restraining them, destroying their weapons, destroying the shed, even though he hasn't quite built it yet, but I can tell he's sort of trying to build it, and I think it's interesting because I think these, it makes you think in a sort of, maybe it's not so clear cut. Obviously the answer to that is yes, I must be allowed to do that, because otherwise I can only do it after something terrible has happened. But then how do you square that with my idea that you should be allowed to say whatever you want? And it's like, well, what is he doing more than speaking? Is there more to speech than the words? Is he somehow programming reality? It's interesting because the EU now terms smart contracts as spells. Like in their documentation, the reason they said that smart contracts are different to free speech, the reason we can go after you when you write these contracts that anonymize it, if you write Tornado Cash, what they said was that code is not speech. They said that code was like a spell, because when you said it, something happens. And that was like, what? I can say, I mean, I can make a speech. Martin Luther King made a speech, and that had effects. That changed people's opinion. That made people do different things. But it was the first time that I suddenly thought, God, maybe we are, wizards. Maybe coders. We're actually doing something functional. Does your language have a functional aspect to it? Can you define the functionality of the language that you're using? So that when you speak, it actually isn't just words. It isn't just saying, "Oh, I like, the weather's good today, and I'm just going to go out and sit outside and get a bit of sun and all that." When you're coding, that has a functionality to it. So when he's saying, "I'm going to build weapons, I'm going to harm you and your family," is that a functional? Is he saying something more than words? Is there a scale? Is it a step function? At what point does that stop being just speech and start being something more than speech? When I don't believe in hate speech. People say hateful stuff all the time. People on both. Somebody says something you don't like, somebody else says something you don't like. But this idea of functionality to speech, this idea that your words actually have real world, objective, physical consequences, that you're actually changing the world. That's quite interesting. And yeah, so that's, sorry, Neo. Yeah, what are you saying,
We've
buddy?
strayed very far away from anything dev-related, which is totally fine. I mean, everyone present on the stage will you guys are all very lucky because you won't be seeing any recording of Patty talking like this. So this is really a one of one.
What, are you recording this? You're recording this, yeah? You said
I am recording this, but
Oh,
you've mentioned some things we're not going to be uploading to YouTube.
What you censoring? What, Neo? Don't tell me that. Yeah, that's exactly the point. This is freedom of speech. Yeah, you want people to be able to say.
This is a Minima public dev call. It's not a Spartacus rants free for all.
Okay. Oh well, that's even better then. So they get it, and no one else will. All right, that's a pity. Oof. That makes me feel a bit funny, actually. Exactly. Neo is censoring. Exactly. Neo, what are you doing? It's like, oh my god. I'd love someone else to come up and tell me to shut up or say something or mention any of what they think about freedom of speech and how far it goes, and whether they think code is functional, whether they think that when we write this code which does this blockchain which allows you to do something, that's more than speech, or is code just speech, or is it more than speech? Is there something that I do need to be aware of? That it's like, well, actually, I think it's funny because I think it makes sense if you think about it in sort of quantum terms, yeah, where sort of quantum waves are consciousness, and so words actually have functionality in that they, when you look at the cat, perception makes the cat alive or dead. It actually has a physical quality to it. Do words have that quality? Does speech, which is, is there a level to speech where it becomes intelligent and intelligent? Is it nonsense? Am I spouting nonsense, or is there something beyond which you're actually changing the world with your words? That doesn't change the world. Oh, I like ice cream. Yeah, I mean that might influence someone to buy that type of ice cream, I suppose. Is there anything that you can say that doesn't functionally affect the world? I don't know. Yeah. So
I have a question. I have a question for the audience, specifically the Russian users in the chat. I'd like to know who is behind the Minima Penguins project on Minima, because I know the guy's name is King on Telegram. I'm not sure if this person is present here or not, and if you know who that is on Discord, then please let me know, because we're interested in what they're building. They're building this basically domain names on Minima, so we'd like to know how they're
ENS
doing
on
it.
Minima.
Yeah.
Unstoppable ENS names, yeah, hopefully.
Well, we don't know if it's a centralized solution or not. You're asking me if it's on
yeah,
a server.
I'd love to know more about the tech. I'd love to know whether it is that. But even if it's a sort of semi-centralized, I mean, I suppose if you can have a distributed centralized solution where multiple people can run a centralized system and you can pop in, so if you had a DEX order book that anybody could run, so that if they took down one DEX order book, you can access another one. That's a sort of distributed centralized solution. So it's not a decentralized solution where it's a sort of distributed centralized solution. There's lots of different ways that you can think about decentralization, but I'm totally up for any of these systems. If they work, they work. If they can withstand attack, then that's what they're there for. They have to withstand the attack. So how does it withstand somebody else trying to buy your domain name? How does it withstand somebody trying to spam your domain name, or or DOS it, denial of service, so that no one can access it. These are really the attacks that blockchain, solves, so that you can't do those things. And I'd love to know, why do they call it penguins? Sorry, is it .penguin? Why is it a penguin?
Initially it was an NFT project, and
Right. But now
you
they've
know,
gone over to ENS names. All right. Okay.
well, they need to set up
Um,
some sort of benefit system for their holders. So
they need to have some way of paying people. Yeah.
no, like people bought the NFTs, and so with the NFT you get one or two free domain names, right? You can register a free domain name. Just a
Right.
regular
Right.
benefit.
I
But it's
mean,
interesting. They
if
have a
you want
nice
to,
brand. Looking forward to
you're,
it.
I mean, talking about NFTs, sorry, because there is something coming back down from quantum functional programming. NFTs are what Minima does is interesting, because I look at all the L2 stuff and all the Omnia stuff and all the L2 stuff, and I've been looking at the papers that they're written. Very smart guys writing very smart papers, but they have real functional limitations because of Bitcoin. And because of what we do, I can actually change those contracts to be more efficient, to do things that you can't do. And in fact, the L2 contract that you have in the white paper is now different from the L2 contract I use, because of the fact that we have state variables, and so I can actually use a Boolean as one of the state variables to tell me whether it's a settlement transaction or an update transaction, without having to use 4 signatures, which again increases simplicity, reduces friction, less barrier to entry, more developers will be able to code it, and all of this sort of compounding. And how do you give someone a private key in a safe way? Because once you've given it to them, you can't take it off them. Once I know the private key, I can't then give you back the private key, because I have a copy of it too. And whether or not I say that I've deleted it, that's not good enough. So once you've shared that information, that's out there now, and you can never get it back. And this is important because I was looking at state chains, and on state chains, you have to give the private key to a second user, and then both of you have the private key as well as the second party. And as long as, and so the more people you give the state chain to, the more people have a copy of the private key, the more chance there is that one of them can hack the state chain entity and then pinch the money. And actually, so what I've done is, and I've written the smart contract for doing, because I'm trying to write a little paper to give to the USDT guy. So just a little bit of tech here. I'm trying to write a white paper about why Minima is so perfect for this USDT thing. And one of the things that's nice about it is that, imagine instead of having a multi-sig address, which says, you need 2 of 3 signatures to spend from this, in Minima, with Minima scripting, you can say, if 2 of these NFTs out of these 3 NFTs, as in the token ID, is in the transaction, you can spend this coin. So you could say, look, if get out token ID is something, and if get out 2 is something, is one of these, and if that's one of these, then you can spend this coin. And so then what you do is you've come up with an NFT key. So think of it as an actual key. There's only one of them. There's only one of these keys. It's a true NFT. There's not 10 of them or 1,000 of them. There's no decimal places. There's just one. And you can come up with an address that can only be spent if 2 of the keys are in the transaction. And why is that cool? Because if you have a 2 of 3 multi-key address, when Jazz went on holiday, we could have just given the key. We said, right, now you've got the key, and now he could have been used in that 2 of 3 multi-key address. And then when Jazz came back, he could give her the key back. And now he doesn't have a copy of the private key. So now you can it's the same as giving someone the private key, but in a way that means you can take it back because you've actually made it into an NFT. And that's cool because you can actually integrate that into state chains. And instead of having a lightning channel that requires a 2 of 2 multi-sig, you can have a lightning channel which requires a 2 of 2 multi-key. And then I can give the key to someone else, and the previous owner cannot now pinch the money if they talk to the state entity. So that's a really nice feature, which again just simplifies, means you could do, another thing that's interesting is that, necessity is the mother of invention. And when you're we're still restricted on Minima. I've got a phone. I can't do a lot of transactions per second. The scripting, we don't have big databases, all of this, but you can come up with solutions for anything, and actually just a little bit of tech can bloom into just the most fantastic solutions and the most wonderful things that you can do. So as somebody who was sort of anti NFTs way back when, I'm now like really pro NFTs. I really like them because you can use them not as a store for a monkey JPEG, but as a way of accessing addresses in a key way. Where so you think of it as an actual safety deposit box, and there's 3 keys, and you've got to stick 2 in and turn them at the same time, and that opens the box, and then you can spend the money. And it's like, you could do that. I haven't seen this anywhere. It's funny actually because I would have thought somebody would have come up with this multi-key addresses, but I've not seen them. I certainly haven't seen them on UTXO systems because none of them have the token ID thing that we have. But yeah, NFTs are cool. NFTs are, they're good. I like them. I'm using them. I'm going to see what I can do with them. So, denial access the original owner to cancel it if necessary. No, because you sent no. I'm just seeing Joshua's question. No. You give the NFT to someone else, and then they have the NFT key, so you don't have access to it anymore. It's just like a normal NFT, a one NFT. It's just one thing. It's a key, and it's got its own token ID, and you can make an address which spends funds if you stick 2 of these key or 3, 3, whatever you want. So that's quite interesting. And just to say as well, if you had multiple keys, you can only have you can use one signature for multiple keys, which is also interesting because it means that your transaction size can be made smaller. So lots of little things pop out once you start thinking about the little bits of tech that we have on Minima. I really hope we get to use some of these systems. Neo, anything else, sir? Any other questions being asked?
Not that I see. Sorry, I had an insurance guy at my door asking me for my apartment insurance
It's a scam.
certification.
Don't let him in. Don't let him in. It's funny actually because I don't answer my mail and I don't answer my phone to numbers that don't appear in my address book because it always says spam caller anyway, so I never answer. So it's quite hard to get hold of me actually, and nothing bad's happened to me. It almost makes me think, God, they were all scams because none of the stuff that I haven't answered has turned out to be something that I had to do. I'm not missing anything, so don't answer, Neo, unless you know who it is. Just don't get involved. Unless they send you a message over chain mail, yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't know who it is. We'll see. He's gonna ring back after. What did I want to say? There are no questions, by the way, Paddy. Fortunately for you.
Sorry.
But I did. So Discord's got this new feature where you can have a guild tag. So like if you're a part of a server and this server has a tag, you can put it on your profile. I've just set that up this morning. If any of you are interested in joining the cult, it's not actually a cult, by the way.
Did you add? You've made me a Minima tag, I think. Is that what you've done?
You can, yeah, you can add it to your profile.
I
don't remember.
I'm
if
trying to
you
become a
click on the
different
server
person.
settings.
I want to be separate. I want to be.
Well, then be separate. I mean, it's
I'm going
optional.
to.
Just
I'm going to.
putting it out there. And aside from that, I mean, I may be putting. Is my mobile mining possible on Minima?
Yeah.
Well,
You don't get paid, Jawar.
yeah.
You don't get paid for mining on Minima, but you all mine all the time. That's the point. We're the cooperative. Yeah. So everybody adds their little bit of power to the network. Yeah. Okay. Actually, fun enough now. I think we've hit the deadline.
We're on
1
time.
o'clock.
Yeah.
We're on time.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry we didn't talk much about Minima. We were talking about blockchain stuff, and the heart of what we're doing here. This is the nuts and the guts of why we do what we do. And I do think that has been playing in the news, all week. And you have to ask yourself these questions when you're working on this tech, and what it will amount to, what will happen in the future, what kind of world we're going to build when we allow you to do these things without anybody being able to stop you. Maybe it's because I mean, I'm not a faith man. Yeah, I'm not a religious person or all that, but I do have faith in humanity. I do believe that humans themselves are, wonderful and great, and that 99.9% of us are good, in that sort of, if there is a scale, my own subjective scale of right and wrong, most of you do the right thing. And so I believe that the world that this is going to create is a better one. And in a sort of twist to that, if the world we create when we give people this technology isn't great, and if we end up wiping ourselves out, then we don't deserve it. Yeah, we don't deserve to be the ones that take over the universe. It's like that's the sort of compact I have made with myself. I now believe in this technology. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in freedom of value. And I believe that is going to produce a better world. And if it doesn't, then we're not the ones. It'll be another race 10,000 years from now with longer arms and less hair, and they can have a shot at being the ones that can sort it out. Do we actually have the intellect and the power and the knowledge and the to achieve something wonderful? If what we have achieved already is not to be considered wonderful, which many would say is, that is really the point of why I'm working in this industry. And if I didn't believe that, then I couldn't work in this industry. And I know lots of people don't believe that, which is why they think so badly about crypto and blockchain and Bitcoin and Minima and all of this, because they don't think that, and they do feel that we need to be sort of shepherded, and they don't think we can make these decisions ourselves. And I just don't believe that. And so I hope that all the tech that we work on will eventually lead to that world that we have been discussing in this conversation. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Yep. Thank you so much for listening. We'll try to make the next one more techie. I'll get some smart contracts and I'll show them to you and all of that. But it's always a pleasure to speak to you all. And I hope there's some rendition of this at some point on YouTube without too much censorship, because that's like, I can't even believe you said that, Neo. And we're gonna have to chat.
There's gonna be a lot. Be careful.
No,
it's just a warning.
Have a chat after. Right.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Let's do it. That's it. Thank you. Nice. Good to chat.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.